It was an ordinary autumn day when the Thompsons moved into their new home on Hollow Street. The neighborhood seemed peaceful, with its tree-lined streets and well-kept lawns. The house they purchased, however, came with a peculiar reputation. It was common knowledge among the locals that the old Victorian at the end of the street had a dark history. A house with a past marred by a string of eerie occurrences. The Thompsons were a young family, excited about their new start. Mike, the father, was a dedicated teacher, and his wife, Emily, was an artist who worked from home. Their two children, Sarah and Ethan, were eager to explore the new house and make friends in the neighborhood. The family moved in on a sunny Saturday, excited for the adventure that lay ahead. Their neighbor, Mr. Johnson, lived in the house next door. He was an elderly man with a disheveled appearance, and his demeanor sent shivers down their spines the moment they met him. He wore tattered clothes and seemed perpetually unkempt. His eyes were like two hollow pits, and his voice held a sinister edge that made Emily uncomfortable. But they brushed aside their initial unease, thinking it was merely a case of first impression. Weeks passed, and the Thompsons settled into their new lives. The children made friends in the neighborhood, and Emily's art studio began to flourish. However, a sense of unease began to creep over them. Odd occurrences became part of their daily life. They would find dead birds scattered in their backyard, and the children would wake up with terrible nightmares. One evening, Emily was working late in her studio, her thoughts consumed by the eerie atmosphere that surrounded their new home. She decided to take a break and headed to the kitchen for a cup of tea. As she opened the refrigerator, she was startled by the sight of a strange note. It read, "You don't belong here." Her hands trembled as she realized that the message was in the distinctive handwriting of their neighbor, Mr. Johnson. She rushed to her husband and showed him the note, and his expression darkened. He knew they had to confront Mr. Johnson about it. The following day, Mike went over to the old man's house, hoping to clear the air. Mr. Johnson greeted him with a sinister grin, making it clear that he was the one who had left the note. "I've lived here a long time," Mr. Johnson said, "and I don't appreciate newcomers like you invading my space." Mike tried to reason with him, but it was clear that Mr. Johnson was not interested in being neighborly. As Mike returned home, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were not safe in their new home. He discussed it with Emily, and they decided to install security cameras around the house to ensure their family's safety. The cameras didn't reveal anything unusual for a while, but the tension in the household continued to grow. Emily's art began to suffer, and the children's nightmares persisted. One night, Sarah woke up to a chilling sight in her room. A shadowy figure loomed at the foot of her bed, whispering indiscernible words. Terrified, she screamed, and her parents rushed into her room. There was no sign of an intruder, but the feeling of malevolence hung in the air. Their neighbor, Mr. Johnson, was the prime suspect, but without concrete evidence, there was little they could do. They decided to involve the local authorities and shared their concerns. The police promised to keep an eye on Mr. Johnson, but their case was circumstantial at best. The situation continued to escalate. The Thompsons' lives became a nightmare, with the feeling of being constantly watched and the eerie events intensifying. They decided to take a drastic step and started looking into the history of their house and the neighborhood. Their research revealed a horrifying truth. The Victorian on Hollow Street had a dark past. Decades ago, a family had lived there, and the father had been involved in occult practices. The house had been the site of sinister rituals and gruesome murders. It was believed that the spirits of the victims were bound to the house, seeking revenge on anyone who dared to live there. The family now understood the malevolence they were dealing with, and they realized that Mr. Johnson was more than just an odd neighbor. He was the embodiment of the malevolent spirits bound to the house, their tormentor in human form. With this newfound knowledge, the Thompsons knew they had to leave, but they couldn't do it quietly. They decided to confront Mr. Johnson one last time, armed with their research about the house's history. As they entered his home, they were met with a chilling sight. Mr. Johnson stood in the center of the room, his eyes glowing with a malevolent light. The air was thick with an oppressive darkness. He whispered, "You don't belong here," and the room seemed to come alive with sinister apparitions. The Thompsons stood their ground, reciting an incantation they had found during their research. The spirits of the past victims began to materialize, and a fierce battle between good and evil unfolded in that cursed house. The spirits, fueled by the Thompsons' determination, overcame Mr. Johnson's malevolence, banishing him from the house and breaking the curse that had plagued it for decades. With their home cleansed of its dark history, the Thompsons were finally able to live in peace. The nightmare was over, and the neighborhood returned to its tranquil state. They had survived a true creepy neighbor horror story, one that would haunt their memories for years to come. But now, they could begin to rebuild their lives, knowing the true horrors that could lurk behind the facade of a seemingly peaceful neighborhood.